So I have this confession to make. I am still kind of in holiday mode. And when I walked in today, just 15 minutes before the service started, there were many who were already starting to panic, but yes, I am here. Maybe it's because my holiday wasn't quite as relaxing as I had hoped. For those of you who don't know, we took this road trip, and it was a long road trip. Out to Ontario first to help move my son and his partner back to Calgary. And we had thought originally we were going out there because we were going to pack all his stuff in a U-Haul and travel back through the States with a U-Haul. And I must admit, as I started thinking about that more and more, I had these visions of our car breaking down somewhere in the Dakotas, stuck on the side of the road in 100-degree weather, waiting for our car to be fixed. And so thankfully, we found someone who would move their stuff without having to have a U-Haul. So that was good. But instead, we had 6 people in our SUV, which was very squishy, very squishy. And we headed from Toronto, where we had visited Dave's sister, in a lovely sort of visit, to New York for a holiday, because in my mind, you can never have too much of New York. And I think this was my 10th trip to New York. This time it wasn't like I had hoped. I don't know if you've ever been on a holiday with 6 people, but it is pretty tough to balance all the interests of those who had come along, because some wanted to be out early in the morning to make sure they made the most of their day, and others wanted to sleep in because they were on holidays, and some loved to shop, and some loved to sightsee, and some had been there many times and seen almost everything, and others wanted to take in every tourist trap the Big Apple had to provide. And I, as the one who had convened this party, felt like I was responsible for everyone's happiness, and I can tell you now, I did not succeed. Because New York in July is hot and sticky. And we were in a basement suite I got on Airbnb. If you don't know what that is, it's a website where people rent out space in their homes. And the reality on the pictures was not quite what I had hoped. The air conditioning didn't work, and so nights were almost unbearable, hot and sticky. And that left us very tired, which, as you can imagine, contributes to the relationship issues which might ensue. So when we left New York, after 5 days, I was ready to go. And my poor husband, we drove that SUV in Manhattan. And his life flashed before his eyes very many times. So thank you, Dave, for the driving. But we left New York and drove a whole day, 6 o'clock in the morning to like 11 o'clock at night, to make it to Chicago, where we stayed for a couple of days. And then in a final push, we decided we were through, and we drove from Chicago straight through to Calgary. That's 30 hours without stopping. Thankfully, we had 3 drivers, but it did have me thinking that I'm getting way too old for this. Because road trips are a lot of fun when you're young and adventurous, but not so much when your ankles swell from the heat and from sitting in a car too long, and you are way past fast food. But as always, when you are on a journey with people, you learn a lot about yourself and others, good and bad. And I can tell you, I had to look myself in the face a lot of times and say, what is your problem? A road trip always begins with a promise, a vision of what it will be. And I have rose-colored visions of holidays all the time. So for me, I imagine being able to stop along the road and see the sights, and I saw walks down the mall in Central Park that's in every movie that takes place in New York, and I wanted to see 2 or 3 Broadway shows, and I looked forward to the long conversations that we would have about life as we drove, and I believed that we would all become closer on this highway bonding experience. But reality does not always live up to the promise. And along the way, You kind of have to adjust your expectations and refocus your energy and figure out how that initial promise can be reframed to make the best of things. And relationships are strained, but they don't break. And the path does not change. Our destination remains the same, but our perception and expectations of the journey shift as we drive. And that's how I feel about the promises of God to Abraham and these other biblical heroes. They set out with this great promise, and then they encounter trials and difficulties, and they realize it won't be easy, and they adjust their expectations, and they carry on. And this, the biblical writers insist, is what it is meant to live by faith. The book of Genesis begins with this great promise that God has built this beautiful garden for Adam and Eve, and they have this idyllic life, and they're in perfect communion with the divine. And then the choice to eat the fruit and this schism opens, and the journey of Genesis finds this separation of humanity and the divine kind of widening. Like Noah and Abraham, they talk to God, and they're in communion with God. But by the end of Genesis, God is only heard in dreams and visions. But throughout this book, there are these glimpses of this early promise of this simpatico relationship between humanity and the divine. And we see in today's text this promise and this covenant that God has with Abraham. And he's called Abram here. He gets a name change a little later on. He first speaks to God early in chapter 12, and God tells him, go from this country. That was our children's story. Go from this country and leave your relatives and go to this land that God's going to show you. And God says he'll make of Abram a great nation, and he will bless him. There are really three parts to this promise that God makes. God's going to give him land, he's going to have many ancestors, and he's going to be blessed. And God basically tells Abram, I got your back, I'm on your side, everything's going to work out. So Abraham sets out with his wife and his nephew, Lot, with these promises before him. But it doesn't take long before they're sidetracked, because there's a famine in Canaan, which is the promised land. And so Abraham and his company end up in Egypt. And because it says that Sarah is so beautiful, Abraham's kind of afraid that they're going to kill him so that they can get her. And so he tells her, just tell him I'm your brother. And he actually negotiates a marriage between Pharaoh and his wife, Sarah, which doesn't end well, but that's another story altogether. And they acquire in this deal enough livestock so that Lot and he are quite wealthy. And they figure out, well, we can't really be on the same land anymore. There's not enough to support us both. And so Abraham goes to Lot and says, you choose, do you want this side or this side? And Lot takes the best land. Like, what was he thinking? And then Lot gets captured, and Abraham has to rescue him. And so you can see how Abram would be a little skeptical that these promises that God has made to him are going to amount to much of anything. And God comes back to him in today's text, and he has this vision, and it begins with these words, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. I am your protector. Your reward will be very great. And then Abram kind of lets out all of his frustration, because not only has this journey been tough, but he was promised a great nation, and he currently has no children. And he says almost cynically that the heir of his household, now that Lot has gone, will be his slave, Eliezer. But God promises again that his very own heir will inherit. And God takes Abram outside and he tells him, look at the stars and believe that his issue will be greater than can be counted. And then in the text that follows, God and Abraham perform this covenant ritual. And by this, these promises God made to Abraham are bound. And you want to say they lived happily ever after, but this is definitely not the case, because struggles continue. And Abraham and Sarah try to complete the promise by other means, by sending in Hagar to have Ishmael. And life goes on in a messy, convoluted journey to the promises of God. And the schism between humanity and the divine just seems to grow. In time, Abraham, along with his descendants, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, are named as the patriarchs of Israel, and they are celebrated as great heroes, and their faith is set up as an example for us. In the book of Hebrews, the writer's trying to give examples about what this faith looks like, and the writer says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the absolute conviction that there are realities that we have not seen. And although the story of Abraham and Sarah is kind of glossed over, there's no mention of Hagar or Ishmael, what the writer insists is that Abraham's faith was not for himself alone, but for the future generations. The text says that Abraham and Sarah died without receiving the full promise. They saw this fulfillment from a distance. So I kind of want to circle back to these original promises because they are uncomfortable realities associated with them today. This promise of land, specifically that land that is now Israel, gave land to them, territory to them that was already occupied by other people. And scholars believe that many of the people began to worship this God of Abraham in time. It was a polytheistic age, so there were lots of gods. But there seems to have been some consensus that this God of Abraham was present in many of the gods of the time. And there was this eventual synthesis into the God Yahweh, who became the God of this sort of confederation of tribes. But there were still others in that land who maintained their own beliefs. And later in the story, after they've been out to Egypt and Joshua comes back, they take the land, according to the story that was promised, and there is a war to conquer and occupy. And I don't have to tell you, this promised land ended up causing a lot of problems because the struggle to retain the territory by several groups has led to almost continuous war in that part of the world. And I wonder, what does this have to do with the promise of God? The second part of the blessing is a great nation, many offspring, and it's led to a kind of nationalism, an us and them division. And even though Abraham was the father of both Isaac and Ishmael, Abraham chose one above the other, and the enmity between their ancestors continues. And the blessing that was promised was complicated at best. The Jewish people have suffered through exile and diaspora since the very beginning. It is ironic that the covenant for land, offspring, and blessing resulted in a nation that has been defined by exile. It's important to consider what we can make of these promises of God. In a sense, we have to ask ourselves, can God be trusted? It's important to consider the context of these stories. Recent scholarship suggests that the Abraham and the patriarchal stories are actually myths. They're not historical. They're set 3,000 years before Christ, but there's no archaeological or historical evidence that any of these events actually occurred. They are collected and preserved into the scriptures in the first millennium before Christ, around the time of Cyrus, which would be after this Babylonian exile. If you remember the story, they're carried off into exile to Babylon, and they return to Israel. This is well after David and Solomon. So what is notable about the time that these stories are actually written down and put into a book is that there was this explosion of religious movements in the Near East, as well as the rise and fall of a lot of different empires. So we go from the Assyrians to the Babylonians to the Persians, and the Egyptians are in there too. And so there is this real intermingling of cultures and religions in the area that is the Near East. And while most empires asked the people they conquered to adhere to their religions, Cyrus, he let all the people in his empire follow their own traditions. And so in this time, questions about whether God was for all of us or for only us, and intermarriage and mingling with other faiths, they were these tensions that were explored by the biblical writers. And you can see these two streams, at least, that run throughout the Hebrew scriptures. One insists Israel is God's and it is set apart, and God is only for them. And the other promotes God as the ruler of all and welcomes the stranger within their gates. And that's the tension we find even in this story of Abraham. So as we read the text today, we find life and meaning for our time. And we have to do this because this covenant of faith that began with Abraham, that he did not see fulfilled, continues. And we kind of have to take our place on this conveyor belt because we are tasked with keeping the faith and knowing that God's blessings and promises are actually in process. And sort of like my road trip, they need to be evaluated and reformatted and refocused as we go along. And so let's look at this promise of land that was given to Abraham and reevaluate that. We have seen the wars which have been fought over this strip of property that sits on the Mediterranean. How do we reframe this story? Well, Abraham was a nomad seeking a place to rest. The compilers of Genesis were these people who were recently in exile. And for them, this need for a home and a place of peace and freedom was this compelling yearning which framed all their thinking. So too, our culture is in this place of dis-ease, of disparate values and diversity, which sometimes leaves people adrift. This yearning for home is a powerful driver, and the promise that God is our home needs to be mined to bring life to our community. The promise of Abraham of a great nation is made in a time where the worship of God is threatened, and the land has been occupied, and the people have been carried away, and different religions and cultures are everywhere. And this promise of a nation is really a promise of security. It says, you will not be extinguished. You will not be overcome. You will survive. And this message resonates with our church today because decline in our numbers and the rise of alternative spiritualities and the embrace of other religious traditions sometimes threatens to swallow us up. And I, like many of you, wonder if the church will survive, whether Christianity will ever thrive again. But God cannot be contained in one religion or way of practice. God's followers are as many as the stars. And in our day, this promise is a call to recognize God in the face of the other. Those whom God loves are as many as the stars, and God will persist in them even when religions and institutions fail. And as for the blessing that God will enrich our lives, we continue to examine what that really means. Because in a simplistic way, blessing is prosperity and health and beautiful children and a peaceful land. And we continue to work towards those goals. But we've learned that blessings are also found in adversity. That God journeys with us and heals us, even when things aren't going as planned. And in the middle of a hot and humid day in New York, when you just want to scream because nothing is going as planned, God is a cooling breeze and a grounding energy and the light before us. That is the blessing of God. And so, McDougall United Church, God continues to reach for us. God has promised us a home where we come together as community, where we see the face of God in all, and where we are truly blessed. So do not be discouraged. The promises remain, even though the times have changed. And we continue in this faith of Abraham as we carry the light from this generation to the next. We're on a journey. It's a road trip that has some trouble, but the destination is peace with God. So go from this place. Enjoy your journey. Travel together in peace. And the God who is everywhere surrounds you, and the peace of Christ dwells in you, and the Spirit inspires your living. Know these promises are true. Amen.